and I'll be moderating today's call. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. All attendee lines will be muted throughout the call. When we get to the Q&A time after the opening remarks, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom to ask a question, and that way we'll be able to track everyone and be able to call in as many people as possible. If you're on the phone and not able to do the raise your hand function, we will reserve time for you to ask questions at the end of the Q&A portion. And if this means we do not call on all raised hands, please follow up with an email with your questions to cunews@colorado.edu. On today's call, we have Russ Moore, Provost of CU Boulder, and Pat O'Rourke, Interim Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Operating Officer at CU Boulder. We also have on the call Sarah Huntley with the City of Boulder and Chana Gusettis with Boulder County Public Health. I'm going to turn it over now to Russ Moore for some opening comments.
Good afternoon. The Chancellor announced this morning that we are shifting to remote course instruction temporarily. These changes will take effect Wednesday, September 23rd, for a minimum of 2 weeks. We are seeing fewer positive cases on and around campus since announcing a 2-week stay-at-home period last week. Unfortunately, the number of cases is not dropping quickly enough. We've decided that we must take these additional actions to reduce the spread of the virus as we continue with our self-quarantine. Our decision is being made in consultation with local and state public health officials. We want to thank our students who are self-quarantining and helping us to bend the curve in the right direction. To solidify our progress, we're also increasing enforcement on students violating public health orders. Serious public health violations like hosting or attending a large gathering or breaking isolation will result in an interim 10-day suspension. Pending adjudication through student conduct and conflict resolution, the presumptive result if the student is found responsible for this type of violation is suspension for the remainder of the semester. We know this is difficult. These are not normal times. And again, we thank our students, faculty, and staff for their extraordinary efforts to make our campus safe. We are urging everyone in our community to double down efforts to maintain social distancing, wearing face coverings, and avoiding gatherings on and off campus. This is the only way we as a community can resume in-person course instruction. We can do this, but we have to do it together. So we'll now open the call to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. I'm looking at the participants window and I'm looking for hands raised, but I don't see any yet. Oh, I see our first hand. Elizabeth Hernandez with the Denver Post. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I'm wondering what has changed in the past few days, as last week the university and Boulder County Public Health said the transmission wasn't happening in the classroom and it wasn't as simple as going remote. So I'm just wondering what is it that kind of made that change?
But we are beginning to see fewer positive cases since enacting the Boulder County stay-at-home self-quarantine directive that was issued on September 15th. However, we need to further reduce transmission of infection, and we thought that additional actions would help us to achieve that goal more quickly. You are correct. Our classrooms have proven to be very safe, but we think these additional measures will help us achieve our desired state more rapidly.
Jacqueline Allen, what's your question?
I'm wanting to find out, we had heard that there was a possibility that there had been a student fatality. We want to find out if that's true, and also what the current numbers are for CU Boulder. Again, this idea that this has changed in just the last couple of days. Students are saying they feel like they were hoodwinked, that the university waited until a point where they couldn't get some of their money back to announce that they're going to go to all in-person classes.
Jacqueline,
were these students hoodwinked?
Jacqueline, I'm going to answer the first part of your question. We do not have any report of a student death related to COVID-19. In terms of the latter part of your question, Russ?
Yes, so as I alluded to in my opening comments, we are beginning to see a reduction in the number of cases that we're seeing through our surveillance screening. Um, that's positive, but again, we need to achieve that reduction, we believe, more rapidly, and that's why we're taking these measures. I will state from the outset, we always said that we would be prepared to shift modalities should something like this arise. And in partnership with Boulder County, we believe that this is the best decision to make for now. And I want to reiterate, this is a temporary measure that we're taking. If you want further details on this, I can pass this over to Patrick O'Rourke.
Pat, I believe you're muted.
I apologize. In the age of Zoom, you're always run the risk that you're muted. But I wanted to respond to Jacqueline's question, which is that it is not true that we delayed this type of announcement in order to be able to keep tuition, keep fees. We are temporarily pausing in-person instruction in an effort to control infection with the full intention of being able to return to in-campus learning if we are able to provide the type of environment that is safe on campus, which we have, as well as being able to prevent any spread of infection into the community. And so far, there hasn't been spread of infection into the community more broadly, but our highest goals are trying to make sure that that doesn't occur. We have, if we intended to not be fair to the students, we wouldn't have made the investments that we made in order to be able to return students to campus safely, including technology, upgrading the airflow. We want them to be able to safely learn and live on campus, and we're doing everything we can to be able to work towards that goal. And as Russ said, we planned for shifts in operating mode. We communicated very clearly that we might have to do that in the event that there was an outbreak of COVID infection, and that if we can start reversing this testing number, we plan on being able to return to in-person learning so that the students get the educational experience that they want.
Our next question is with Paolo Salcito with CPR.
Hi, yeah, I had a question about what do you think do you think students' habits will change with remote learning? You guys said that transmission is mostly occurring off campus and at parties, at student housing, at fraternity houses. They're all in town. They're all doing remote classes. Do you think, what's the goal with remote? Do you think it's going to stop that spread off campus?
Pat, do you want to take that one?
So there's two things, which is number one is we need to take steps that we can in order to break the cycle of transmission. And this is one of the steps we can take. The other thing that we are doing is that we are significantly increasing our enforcement. We have hit the point where we have tried to educate and be able to work in a manner of progressive discipline. But we need to address the fact that there, notwithstanding that many, if not most of our students are engaging in good behavior, that there have been some who have not, and that by moving to a state where we will be imposing interim suspensions for those students who are accused of violating public health orders or otherwise not complying with things like isolation and quarantine orders with heavier sanctioning, we need them to understand that this is our period of time and our last clear opportunity in order to be able to address this COVID outbreak before we would have to consider changes in status that would be of longer duration. And we need to be clear both with the community and with our student body that we're going to take the steps that are necessary in order to do that.
Do you think suspension is going to teach a lesson to students that are already going out and partying, even with all of these warnings and public health guidelines out in effect right now?
The short answer is we hope so. What we have heard from the students is that what they want to be able to do most is to continue their education. and being in a position where they would not be able to do that because of their behaviors. If they are consistent in what they value and the need to be able to maintain their education, then this is a tool that we can use in order to try to ensure that occurs.
And if I may add, I want to be very, very clear that the vast, vast majority of our students are being absolutely compliant with our COVID safety measures. So I want to be clear about that. They are behaving. Most of our students are behaving quite well, and they're being quite compliant. These measures are actually focused at a very, very small minority of students who unfortunately have put us in this situation.
We're going to go to our next question from Henry Larson. And Henry, can you identify your outlet, please?
Yes, hi, I'm writing for the CU Independent, which is the CU student newspaper here on campus. I wanted to address a comment that the provost just made, that the reason that we are in this position is because of a minority of students. Considering the fact that it was the university that decided to have a form of in-person education this year, what responsibility does the university hold, and what responsibility do students have to keep themselves safe?
We all have a shared responsibility in the provision of education and research opportunities for all of our students. So quite simply stated, it's not just students per se who have contributed to some of the infections that we see in our community, but our responsibility is to work in partnership with our students to try to bend this curve, which we are bending it downward now. And I think through a collaboration with students, I think we can achieve this temporary activities that we have so that we can actually get back into business in hopefully a few weeks.
Our next question is from Katie Langford with Daily Camera.
How many fewer students do you anticipate will be on campus with us? I noticed the release that there's still some exceptions for folks that need to go to in-person labs. So do you have a number as far as how much this is going to reduce campus density?
I'm sorry, Katie, I was having a hard time hearing you. Was that a question of how many fewer students do we expect to see on campus as a result?
Yes. Yeah, it was. I noticed there was some exceptions in the chancellor's statement for some in-person learning to continue. So I was wondering if you had a number on how much campus density would be reduced.
Well, in terms of provision of the in-person educational opportunities, the reduction will be actually quite drastic. I can't give you an exact number because the default is we go remote and then we'll have to respond to exceptions. And we're just now beginning to see those.
But Katie, to follow up, that the baseline presumption is that classes across campus, whether or not undergraduate, graduate law, will be remote for this upcoming period. And it's only those things that absolutely can't be offered in person that would be exempted. And so that should, without looking at all of the different students' class schedules, I can't give you an absolute number, but by moving to this, the presumption would be that it would significantly reduce the number of people who are coming, especially from the off-campus student community, from classes onto campus.
Our next question is from Jacqueline Quinn with Channel 4. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I just wanted to know to what extent you can actually monitor or patrol some of these minority groups that are throwing parties or who are gathering in large numbers. I mean, will campus police be able to stop at some of those Greek organizations, or what can you do here?
So thank you for asking that question. So one of the things we start with is the understanding that this is not just a CUPD issue. This is something that we've been partnering with Boulder County Public Health, the City of Boulder, Boulder Police Department, and that we are all working on this together from an enforcement standpoint. It's too early to be able to draw any definitive conclusions, but the reports that we receive both from our own police department and student conduct people, as well as from Boulder Police, is that over the weekend, they saw much less traffic in the Hill area. They saw many fewer large gatherings. In fact, they said this weekend they didn't see large gatherings at all. Boulder Police still responded to some noise complaints, but it does appear that the behavioral changes are already beginning to take effect compared to what had been seen previous weekends on the Hill. But it is a joint effort, not just a CUPD effort.
And on that note, we do have Sarah Huntley on the call from the city of Boulder. Sarah, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Just that the city is very grateful for the collaborative effort with the university, the county, the public health department, and we will be doing our best to lend enforcement resources as well as prevention and messaging resources to our community during this time.
Does that mean that you guys will actively patrol, just to go where there's a student corridor, make sure that there aren't parties? I mean, that's pretty obvious from just like, browsing if you're driving down the street. Is that kind of what you guys will be doing?
Definitely.
Oh, sorry, Sarah.
I'm sorry, Pat. I was just going to say we've definitely stepped up patrol in coordination and collaboration with CU's police department. We're doing this together. We obviously, when we're talking about our city police force, we have to respond to things that are unfolding across the entire city. So at any given time, we may be able to focus our energies on University Hill and places where there's off-campus student residences. But sometimes our officers also need to be able to respond to other incidents that are unfolding. So we're doing our best to provide an increased presence. We think that's absolutely important. We are still leaning quite a bit into education, but with these quarantine orders that are in effect for one duplex on the Hill currently and recommendations for other students, we are stepping more into an enforcement posture as needed.
Thank you. Next, we have Chris Mosher. Chris, can you say which outlet you're from?
Chris is actually with me. This is Vicente for Fox 31.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Vicente.
Okay, yeah, of course. Thank you. So can you explain to me how, if someone is accused of violating these protocols that you've set forth, how will the process work for suspension? I mean, how will you even know that someone has violated these policies that you've set forth?
So I can answer that, Vicente. And those are brought into our conduct process normally by a citation that has been issued by either BPD, CUPD, resource officers in order to be able to trigger a referral to our student conduct system. When the referral comes into our student conduct system, that is triggering an interim suspension during the period of time that it takes to adjudicate the case. And then because we're a state institution, we are required to provide due process to students, including notice of what the allegation is against them, an opportunity to be heard, and to explain whether or not there actually is a violation. And then if that violation is established, then a ongoing sanction can be assessed.
And can you give me an example of what a student can be accused of given the protocols that you have set forth? For example, can an accusation be something like, oh, I saw John at a party with a bunch of people and he's a student? Is that what we're talking about here? I just want to understand that process, sir.
No, this would be, that would not be the type of thing that would lead to that immediate exclusion. That would, an example would be if one of our CUDP, for example, determined that a student had was under an isolation order because they were COVID positive and was not obeying with that, they would issue a citation for violation of a public health order, which is what that is. And that violation of a public health order citation would be referred into student conduct. It could be true that somebody could call either CUPD, Boulder Police, or our own resource officers to say that someone was violating in order to trigger that investigation. But that would be the mechanism by which it would get into the system.
Thank you.
We're going to move to see if anyone who is on the phone and unable to raise their hand has any questions. And then if there's time after that, I'll get back to anyone who has their hand raised again. So is there anyone on the phone that would like to ask a question?
Karen Morco with CBS 4 here. I have a question.
Go ahead.
All right, this is kind of in regards to that, but how many students have gone through that process and are on the interim suspension?
There are currently 14 students who are on the interim suspension, which we started working with last weekend. We have well over 100 cases that are currently in the student conduct process, but most of those are not for the significant type of violations such as hosting a party or violating an isolation order that would lead to that immediate type of suspension. The ones that are also in the student conduct process would include, for example, being in a residence hall and not wearing a mask in a common area. That wouldn't be the type of thing that would lead to an interim suspension. It's only the more serious violations. And currently, like I said, there's 14 students who have received the interim suspension.
All right, I have a follow-up. I don't know if I can do that right away, but will students who are currently positive for COVID remain in the isolation dorms there? And how are they being monitored?
So the students who are currently positive, yes, need to remain in the isolation dorms. That is a public health practice and they are required to do that. We do have staff, including residence advisors, as well as professional staff and our community resource officers that are in those facilities in order to ensure that students who are under isolation orders are remaining in isolation.
And as a point of specificity there, the on-campus isolation, those are for students who live in our residence halls. For students who do not live in the residence halls, our medical services team works with them to identify the best option for them in order to isolate. Is there anyone else on the phone that would like to ask a question? In that case, I'm going to go back to the raised hands and we have Jacqueline Allen. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
We had a couple of students ask, is CU Boulder planning to give any tuition or fee refunds because of this?
No, we're not. We fully intend to continue our educational activities. And again, this is a temporary shift in the modality that we're using. But our expectation is that after an interim period, a temporary period, we'll be back in some of our in-person educational experiences.
Our next question is from Paolo with CPR. Go ahead.
Hi, I talked to a couple students immediately after the announcement, and they said that they lost a lot of trust in CU following the handling of COVID-19. And I'm wondering, how are you going to gain back their trust? What moves are you going to make to get that vital trust back within your community?
We'll continue to work in partnership with all of the constituents on campus, faculty, staff, and students, to try to address a situation that is unfortunate. We knew this was a possibility and we have the measures in place to deal with the situation that we're faced with right now. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're beginning to see a positive change in direction of the number of infections that we're seeing. We're trying to accelerate that positive directive, and we'll hopefully move forward, again, in collaboration with everyone. That's the only way we can do this, to get back to our normal business, and hopefully that will help to restore trust.
Our next question, Elizabeth Hernandez, Denver Post.
Thank you. Yes, I also talked to several students who have said things like, you know, their roommate has tested positive and their roommate can't get into isolation right away, so they're left wondering where to go or what to do. Can you tell me what is supposed to happen if a student, I imagine some of this is maybe a student tests positive with the saliva test and they have to confirm with the PCR test, but can you walk me through what that process is supposed to look like? And does it mean some students may have to stay with a COVID positive roommate for a couple of nights?
So the process should be that if a student presumptively receives a saliva-based test, they get referred to medical services for the purposes of having a confirmatory PCR test run. If that confirmatory PCR test demonstrates that the student is COVID positive, then, and those tests occur within 24 hours and basically within the same day, then things are referred to our contact tracing process in order to be able to determine whether or not there are other people who are falling within the definition of close contact or exposed. And any student who is identified as having been in close contact or exposed is moved to isolation or quarantine as quickly as we can. And we are moving students 7 days a week, so there should not be significant delays in being able to have a student get shifted over. If there are any situations where a student is not been contacted about moving into the appropriate type of living arrangement for their disease status, please have them notify our medical services so that we can arrange to address that immediately.
Our next question is from Vicente, and this might be our last question. So anyone else with their hands raised would need to send their questions, please, to cunews@colorado.edu. But Vicente, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. It's a two-part question. Of the 14 students that have been identified and are going through the process now, how long before we know what the next step is? And the second question that I have is, how do police or any other authority know if a student is violating a public health order? Do they know who's positive and who's not? Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, Vicente, can you give me the first part again?
Yes, and I apologize for the two-part question, absolutely. Of the 14 students who have been identified so far that are going through the process, how long before we know what happens to them? Because it sounds like they now are suspended as they go through the process. How do we know what happens to them next? Will they be kicked out of the university should it be determined that they violated a public health order?
So the answer to that is, like I said before, we have to give them notice and an opportunity to respond to that. Our student health team is expediting those cases that have an interim suspension because obviously those are of more seriousness than a case where you don't have that level of interim sanction imposed. Those cases can generally be adjudicated within days, and that hearings are occurring today through Wednesday of this week for those students who were cited over the weekend.
And just to clarify, you said, Pat, the student health office, but I believe you meant the student conduct office for those cases?
Yes, thank you.
And then the second part of the question is, how does an authority even know if someone is violating a public health order? If a student's walking down a sidewalk, how do you know that person is a COVID person that shouldn't be out and about?
Is that
so,
something?
Yeah,
We do have public health on the call, Pat, if you'd like to.
I was actually going to ask if Chana could help address that from the public health standpoint in the community of people who are COVID positive within the dormitories or our own isolation spaces. We do know who those people are, so that we have the ability to address that, and they should not be leaving the facility in which they're currently residing.
So, sorry, this is Chana. What was the other question?
So the question, if I may ask the question again, and thank you, Mr. O'Rourke, you are correct. I am trying to figure out, like, how does the university or public health official know that a student walking down a sidewalk should be in an isolation dorm and should not be out and about because they're COVID positive? How do you track those people who are COVID positive who should be in isolation in order to give them some sort of citation?
We don't know that. unfortunately. So we may have an address or a location where that person lives, but just by seeing them walk down the street, we wouldn't know if they were under an isolation or quarantine order.
I guess my follow-up then to that would be how the 14 that you have so far that are going through the process, how do you know that they violated a public health order? And this may not be for you, Ms. Gusettis. I don't know who could answer that question, but I'm trying to figure out how did you identify those 14 people?
So for example, that would be a student within a residence hall who is been ordered to be in isolation, which means being in a room rather than out in the common areas. So within that particular environment, we would have the ability to issue a citation there and refer it over to student conduct. For other folks who are, for example, if there's an off-campus party at the moment and a police officer cites someone for hosting an off-campus party right now, given the limitations that exist on gatherings in the city of Boulder, then that citation comes from Boulder Police to our student conduct office in order to, as a referral for violation of a public health order.
Thank you.
So with that, we are now over time, so we're going to need to close the call. Thank you everyone for calling in today. I do see Katie Langford, Aaron Prater, Lucy Haggard, and Henry Larson raised their hands. So if you could please send your questions to cunews@colorado.edu. We will answer those as quickly as we can. So again, thank you all for joining, and we are now going to end the call.